Okay, and
All
I believe we're
right.
live. So first, hello to everyone watching the replay. Sorry you couldn't make it, but you get an exact replay, so that's pretty cool. Me and Jason are here today to share 10 mixing mistakes with you. We've got 5 each. I've got 5. Jason's got 5. I don't know what Jason's are. He doesn't know what mine are. So this is going to be fun. We'll see if we've got the same ones. I have no idea if we're
Yeah,
going to
well,
have
and
any
that was
overlap or not.
we we talked about this earlier this week. We were like, should we share? Should we kind of collaborate? And I wanted to make sure we didn't see what we were doing. And so I think it'll be interesting to see if we have any overlapping mistakes. But that'll be fun. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for showing up here on a Saturday. If you are live with us, thanks for spending some time with us here. And our goal here really is just to provide as much value to you as possible. We don't have anything to sell. We're not, trying to pitch you anything. Really, we're just here to help. So so we're going to do about maybe half an hour or so of presenting where we have some kind of slides and some content that we've planned out for you guys. And then we're going to take some time and do a Q&A with you. So if you have any questions, if there are some things that you're struggling with, this is your opportunity to get answers. Hey, Michael, how's it going, man? And hey, if you're just tuning in now, just shoot your name over in the chat box and let us know where you're from too. We got people here from
Yeah,
all around the world, which is so
that's
cool.
a great shout.
I know
Jason,
we're
just
by
So
Sorry, go ahead.
I think you're still frozen. I don't know if you want to try rejoining, and I'll kind of welcome people in because we've still got 5 minutes or so. But let us
Sure.
know in the chat. Actually, we've got some people in here now. Type in the chat if you can see. First of all, if you can see and hear me, okay. If you can hear Jason, and then also
And you
let
could
us know
see
if
me.
Jason's frozen. So Ijoma said frozen. So I think. No, I hope this works itself out. But do you wanna try reconnecting quickly? And
Sure.
I'll welcome people in. We've still got 5 minutes for
Yeah,
everyone that's
absolutely.
watching now. Okay, cool.
I'm
See
actually
you.
going to jump over into Chrome.
Okay, cool. Yeah, give that a shot. All right. See you in a sec, buddy. Okay. So here we go. Who have we got here? Let's look at these. So if you're with us now, first of all, thanks for being here live. I'm going to be sharing some of my templates with everyone that was here live. I mentioned that in the email. So that's going to be coming towards the end. If you just joined, Jason's just reconnecting quickly because he was having some issues with his webcam. But if you're here and you're watching live, let me know where you're watching from. I always love doing this because I can already see that we've got people all over the world. So go to the chat box, say hello, tell me where you're watching from, and let's see if we can cover all of the continents again. So we've got Holland, we've got Duke from Toronto, Michael, thanks for joining us from Colombia. Jason, we've got another Jason. I can see you now.
All right. Hopefully this doesn't freeze. So welcome everybody. I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues here. So we got people from all around the world. It sounds like Italy,
Yeah,
Czech Republic. Wow. And me and Rob were talking about this for a couple minutes before we started. We feel so lucky, I think, to be here and to be sharing with you guys. So, uh, such an amazing opportunity. And so we're going to try to make this as valuable as possible for you and really share as much as we can. This is not going to be one of those kind of flimsy webinars where we talk for 10 minutes and then try to sell you something for an hour. The goal really is to just provide as much value to you guys as possible. So we do have some material that we have planned, and we'll get started in just a couple minutes here. And then we're going to do a Q&A towards the end. So if you do have questions, make sure you stick around towards the end because that's really your opportunity to engage with us and get answers to some of the things that you're struggling with.
And just a quick pointer there. So the first part of this is going to be a presentation. Jason's going to share his 5 mistakes. I'm going to share my 5 mistakes. While that's going on, we won't be answering questions. However, as Jason just said, we will be answering them at the end. So if you go to the chat box, you can see a little speech bubble, and next to it, there's a little arrow. If you click that, you can then change the type to a question. So like this, you should be able to see this. And that's going to help us to actually see the question. So at the end, we can then go back and answer them. So Q&A at the end, we're going to be sticking around, and that's going to be a great opportunity if you're struggling with anything in particular, really, something that you're fighting to get through at the moment that you think you could get some help with, this is a great opportunity for us to at least give our 2 cents and try and help out if we can. So if you have questions, you can answer them while we're doing the presentation, but we will be answering them at the end. Just use that little feature there if you can.
Awesome.
And also for anyone that's just joined us, I will be sharing some DAW templates because you're all here live, which makes you awesome. So to say thank you for that, I've got another kind of cheeky surprise bonus lined up for you as well. So,
I still haven't gotten those templates, by the way. So we're close friends, and he doesn't send me anything. So he's holding out on me, but he's giving them to you. So I think you guys are getting a treat here.
We should exchange templates. That'd be a fun little.
That would be fun. Absolutely.
Recently, I don't know about you, but I've started using channel templates, and for anyone, for everyone that's here watching, give that a go, because templates are so important. And I'm sure you agree with me on this, Jason, for saving time. But I love using channel presets. I don't know if you do this, because then sometimes if you open like a whole project template, you have all the channels there, but you don't always need them. It's always different. So you have to kind of go through and delete stuff. Whereas if you just use channel presets, you just like, okay, I'm going to load up my short reverb. I'm going to load up my delays. I'm going to load up submix, etc.
Okay, so it sounds like I'm sorry. I'm just reading the chat box here. It sounds like I'm a little bit louder than you are. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that here. Thanks for letting me know, guys.
So I just turned my mic up a bit.
1, 2.
Let's see if that's better.
You guys tell me if this is a good balance between both of us here. So we're going to get started. Yeah, we're going to get started in just a minute or two here. But welcome, everyone. We got people from all around the world. Boise, Idaho. Hey, Carl. Good to see you, man. Kevin, Sebastian. We got people from, let's see, Italy, Greece, South Africa, Singapore, France, Canada.
Got some people from the UK, which is always
amazing.
Nice to see. So let us know in the text before we start now. Are we about the same volume now?
Yeah.
Sounding better. Good.
I guess how many audio engineers does it take to get the
to balance two mics?
To balance 2 mics.
Okay, this is the thing. I can't hear myself. So I have no idea how loud I am. But hopefully we've got that. So if you're having any issues with video and audio just in general, there's a big refresh. I think it's refresh or reconnect button under our faces, you should see. If you hit that, that'll kind of refresh your page and reconnect you. And that should help you too loud now. Okay. I'll turn mine down a bit.
Cool.
We should be about.
So hopefully that should be good. Yeah, it sounds like Mike will go down. See, we got a bunch of audio engineers here trying to balance this out.
I don't know who Michael is, but I'll try and go down for you.
Okay, so
yeah, should we jump in now? Because
I think we should. It's around 10 o'clock, so hopefully. Okay, now it's too low. So hopefully, I'm going to get started here. So we'll adjust this as we go. So first of all, thank you guys so much for being here, for spending Saturday with us. If you're here live, if you're watching the replay, sorry you missed it, but hopefully, we'll be able to provide enough value to you anyway. So I'm Jason. For those of you who don't know me, I run a site called BehindTheSpeakers.com. And my goal really is to help musicians, songwriters, people who are recording their own music, take their mixes from good to great. So everything I do is really focused on giving you techniques and tactics and tips to really elevate what you're doing and take your mixes to the next level. So really the goal here of this workshop is for us to share 10 of the biggest mixing mistakes that we see so many people making. And for me, when I was kind of putting together the material for this, I wanted to think about kind of the big picture. And I think people get so kind of distracted by the small tactical stuff. They think they need to really understand, the kind of minutiae of how to use a compressor and an EQ and all these kind of small things. And those things are very important. But I think, what I see a lot is when people are struggling with the mixing process, if they're feeling frustrated because they're listening to, their favorite tracks and their music just doesn't sound as good as their favorite artists, oftentimes the problem is this kind of big picture stuff. It's not the small tactical little things. It's really kind of that kind of broader perspective. So these mistakes on my end are really focused on the big picture here. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and share my screen. So Rob, just jump in because I can't see the chat box here. So let me know if you can't see this. Okay, as we go.
I can see you fine. Go ahead.
Cool. Okay. So mistake number one is something that I call aimless mixing. And really, when we're talking about aimless mixing, what I'm really talking about is mixing without intention. So just kind of going through the mixing process in a kind of meandering way, just hoping that at some point we end up getting to where we want to be, but not really having a system or a process or a goal that we're shooting for. Now, a symptom that I find in people who are kind of falling victim to aimless mixing is that if I pull up their sessions, oftentimes I'll see a lot of plugins. So when we start adding processing for no reason and just kind of throwing plugins on things, just hoping that we're going to kind of get to where we want to be, oftentimes what happens is you end up with a ton of processing on all of the different tracks in your mix. And now this isn't always the case. I mean, there are a lot of people that tend to be heavy-handed with plugins and processing, and their mixes sound good. But if you find that your sessions have a ton of processing on them, this might be an indication that you might be falling victim to aimless mixing. So there are a couple of problems with aimless mixing. The first is that it's really a slow and arduous process, right? When you're going through the mixing process, just kind of randomly throwing plugins on things without any system or goal, you end up taking a lot more time to get to where you want to be. And so one of the other challenges with this is that you have no idea when you're done a lot of the time. And this is one of the things that I hear so often from people. How do I know when the mix is finished? I feel like I'm always I keep going and I don't know when to stop. If you're mixing aimlessly, if you have no goal, then there's no way to know when you're done. And so you end up spending a lot more time than you need to on the mix. And the main problem of aimless mixing is that you end up ruining a lot of the times what you've created, because as we'll talk about a little bit later, spending more time on a mix doesn't necessarily make it better. So there is a better way. And if you're saying this sounds like me, you're not alone. I mean, this was certainly something that I struggled with for a long time. So the solution is something that I call responsive mixing. So this is so important, and I just want to frame this that, to me, this is kind of the core of the entire mixing process. And if you can really understand this idea, then your mixes are going to improve by leaps and bounds. I think this is, if there's one thing you can walk away with from my presentation here, it should be this. And that's that every decision that you make in the mixing process should always be a response to something that you hear. So really, mixing is this process of listening to the sound that's coming out of the speakers and then identifying something and addressing that using the tools and the tactics and techniques that we have at our disposal. So the key point here is that there's always a reason for every move that you make. You're never adding plugins for no reason, just kind of grabbing things and moving faders without any intention. There's always something that you're trying to do, right? And so a good way to think about the mixing process is really, it's nothing more than problem solving. So mixing is this kind of loop, right? We're listening to the mix and suddenly we notice that there's a problem. Maybe the bass sticks out as being too loud in a certain spot. So we've identified a problem, right? And then we're responding to that problem by saying, okay, how can we fix that? Well, we might add a compressor to the bass, or we could turn the bass fader down, or maybe we could use some automation. So we've come up with a couple of ways to potentially solve that problem. And then we go and try and address that problem using one of our solutions. And then we evaluate the solution. We say, okay, did we fix the problem? And if we did, then we go back to step one, try to find another problem to solve. And if we didn't, then we go back and try to come up with a different solution to solve the problem. So really, mixing is nothing more than just a series of solving problems again and again and again until the mix is finished. And so if you can do this, if you can really make sure that every move that you make in the mixing process is a response to something that you hear, you're always trying to solve a problem, then you're going to be able to craft better mixes, and you're also going to finish much faster because this is a much more deliberate and intentional way to move through the mixing process. And so bringing this down to a really actionable question that you can ask yourself while you're mixing. Whenever you add a plugin or grab a fader, ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I adding this plugin? Why am I adding this EQ? And if you don't have a reason, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. So again, this is kind of a core question that can kind of challenge you to remain responsive while you're mixing. And the more that you can do this, the better your mixes are going to be. This is one of the biggest ways and the most important ways to improve the sound of your mixes. So mistake number 2 is ignoring your listening environment. So we covered this idea of responsive, right? And that what we hear guides our decisions. Now, we typically trust that what we're hearing, the sound that's coming out of our speakers, is accurate. But what if it isn't? So I want to show you here a graph. This is a frequency response graph of a pair of flat studio monitors. So this is a good pair of studio monitors in a typical home studio. So people spend so much time thinking about trying to find the flattest studio monitors, and they spend thousands of dollars on these really great studio monitors, and then they put them in a home studio. And if you look at the graph here, you'll see that this is far from flat, right? There are massive peaks and valleys, and this is what your speakers are going to sound like in a typical home studio room. And even in the best listening environment, oftentimes you're going to see a frequency response like this, where there are just massive peaks and valleys. It's far from flat. So why should you care about this? Well, the bottom line is, if this is what your studio sounds like, it's nearly impossible to make the right decisions. And so you end up being misled, right? Because you're not hearing an accurate representation of what's going on in your mixes. And so what happens is that your mixes end up sounding like the inverse of your room. So for example, if your room has a big bump down at 60 hertz at the bottom of the frequency spectrum, you're constantly going to feel like that area of your mixes is too loud. And so you're going to respond by turning down that area of your mixes using EQ, or maybe turning down the bass or the kick or anything that's in that area of the frequency spectrum. And so your mix ends up sounding balanced in your studio, but when you bring it out to other speakers or other listening environments that don't have those same sets of problems, your mixes end up translating poorly. So if you've ever experienced the car check nightmare where you spend an entire day or two working on a mix and then you bring it out to the car and it totally falls apart, this is what's happening, right? You're being misled by the sound of your room because it's not giving you an accurate representation of what's really going on in your mixes. So what do you do about this? Well, the bottom line is that you can easily improve the accuracy of your listening environment, and you don't have to spend a ton of money to do it. So the first thing that I recommend starting with is start by finding the right spot in your room for your speakers and your sweet spot. And this is going to make such a massive difference. And I think so many people overlook this. They immediately go to acoustic treatment and they spend thousands of dollars on new monitors. But speakers and your sweet spot, they work similarly to microphones. And so if you've ever done any degree of recording, you know that if you move the mic just a couple of inches, the sound that you get changes dramatically. So speakers work in the same way. So just moving your speakers 6 inches or a foot can dramatically change the sound that you're getting from that speaker. So you want to start by finding the right spot for your speakers and your sweet spot in your room. And so if you're looking for some kind of actionable ways to do this, I put together a video with 7 tips that will help you get there, that will help you find the right spot for your speakers and sweet spot. And I'm going to give you the link to download it at the end of my presentation, so stick around for that. So after you've found the right spot for your speakers and sweet spot, then you want to move into acoustic treatment. And this is, again, kind of the next level. I think it's an important part of prepping your room for mixing, really getting the best response out of your room. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars on acoustic treatment. You can build your own bass traps and things like that. It's a little bit out of the scope of this presentation, but just know that, in my opinion, I think acoustic treatment is an important part of really getting the most out of your listening environment. And finally, after you've added acoustic treatment, after you've found the right spot for the speakers and sweet spot in your room, then you can move into room correction software. So, there's a lot of debate about whether or not these tools are helpful. I've done a lot of testing with them, and I found that they can be an invaluable part of the mixing process. So essentially, the way these tools work is they come with a measurement microphone, and you measure the frequency response of your room. And then these tools basically create an EQ curve that compensates for the peaks and valleys in your room. And that EQ curve sits on your mix bus, and you listen through it and mix through it. And then you turn it off before you print the final mix. So essentially, these tools further kind of even out the frequency response of your room, and they'll help you make better mixing decisions because they'll give you a more accurate representation of what's really going on in your mixes. So I recommend checking out SonarWorks Reference 3. This is a plugin that I use that I think is one of the best out there for room correction, but there are a couple of tools that are all great. So again, the key point here is that this is kind of the cherry on top. So you don't want to just jump to this before optimizing the speaker and sweet spot placement and adding acoustic treatment. This should be kind of the last step in the process. So mistake number 3 is abusing the solo button. Now, the goal of the mixing process is we're trying to make a group of tracks fit together as a unit. So nobody cares what the sound of the individual tracks are in your mix. Nobody cares what the kick drum sounds like on its own. Nobody cares what the vocal sounds like in solo. The only thing that matters is how everything sounds together. I mean, think about the word mix, right? We're trying to mix things together. So it doesn't matter how things sound on their own. So the problem with the solo button is that the solo button removes context. So when you solo a track, suddenly you're listening to it on its own, right, in a vacuum. And so you have no idea how that track relates to other tracks in your mix. You have no idea how it fits with the rest of your mix. And so when you solo tracks and start making decisions, maybe EQing or compressing tracks, you end up making those tracks sound better in solo. But those decisions that you make don't often hold up in the mix. So if you think about it, oftentimes in order to make a track work in the mix, you actually have to make it sound worse on its own. So if you solo, for example, a vocal in a good sounding mix, oftentimes that vocal is going to sound super bright and harsh and edgy. And you'd never make those decisions and make that track sound like it on its own. But the key is that those decisions help make that track cut through the rest of the mix. And so it actually is the right move to make that track sound super harsh and bright and edgy because it helps make it fit better together with everything else. So you can never make those kinds of decisions if you're just soloing tracks. The key is you want to listen to everything together because, again, it doesn't matter how tracks sound on their own. So the solution here is to avoid the solo button as much as possible while you're mixing. And this can be challenging, especially for newer mixers who feel like when they solo tracks, it can help them zero in on what they're focusing on. So if they're focusing on the vocal, they feel like they want to solo the vocal because you're less distracted by all the other stuff that's going on. But this is a mistake. So you want to catch yourself in these moments and really force yourself to listen to things in context. Even if you think it's harder to make decisions, you're going to be able to make better decisions if you're listening to everything together. And if you do find yourself making a decision in solo, you want to always finalize it in context. So unsolo the track, listen to it with the rest of the tracks in your mix, and make those final tweaks to your plugins or EQ or compression with all the tracks playing together. And again, if you do this, this is such a massive mistake. If you avoid the solo button, your mixes are going to improve by leaps and bounds. I guarantee you. Mistake number 4 is mixing in a vacuum. Now, to improve, if you want to get better at mixing, you got to have critical feedback. So there's no way around it. And so many people in this kind of new digital age where we can finally create music all on our own, we're just kind of toiling away in our home studio and just kind of making music on our own, right? And we never share it with anyone else. And this is a mistake. And now we avoid sharing it often because it's demoralizing to get real feedback, right? When people tell us, hey, this sounds all right, but you can really improve here, or maybe you didn't do this so well, it's demoralizing. So we don't want to hear we don't want to hear people telling us stuff that we're not doing well. So we end up avoiding it. And this is a mistake. So it's really mixing in a vacuum, right? Mixing with no context, with no feedback from anyone else. And if you want to improve, this is not what you should be doing. So, a couple solutions to this. The first is really easy because it doesn't actually involve anyone else. You can do it on your own, and that's to use references. And so when I say references, I mean importing commercial tracks into your session, tracks that were recorded and mixed by other artists, stuff you haven't worked on personally, and comparing your mix to these references while you're working. And the reason why this is so powerful is because it's instant context, right? It will give you a perspective that you wouldn't get if you were just mixing kind of in a vacuum on your own without listening to any references at all. And so it can help you avoid going down the wrong path where maybe you start adding a ton of low end, for example, to every track in your mix, and suddenly your mix sounds just super boomy and the bass is overwhelming. If you compare your mix to references while you're working, you can help sidestep some of those mistakes because you can listen to the way the references sound. And so it gives you this instant kind of perspective, which can be really helpful. So the picture over there on the right is a tool that I like to use. It's a plugin called Magic AB. And it sits on your mix bus, and it allows you to import different references into your session directly into the plugin. And so you can see there's that A and B button there, and you can just switch very easily back and forth between all these different references and your mix while you're working. So I think that's one of the easiest ways to incorporate references into your sessions, and I definitely recommend you check out that plugin. Now, the other solution to this is you want to seek out critical feedback. So I underline critical because I'm not talking about showing your music to your mom or your girlfriend or your best friend. They're always going to tell you what you're doing is great, right? You want to find people who are better than you, who can help you level up, who can really give you the critical feedback you need to improve. So this might be a mentor, this might be a community. Rob has a great community called Musician on a Mission that I recommend checking it out. That's a great community of people who are all, engineers and musicians, and you really want to be surrounded by people who can help you improve what you're doing. So seeking out that critical feedback, even if it doesn't feel good, is one of the best ways to improve, and it's certainly going to accelerate your progress. And the last thing is share your work. So we're all perfectionists. We all think, there's going to be this moment in time where suddenly we reach this point of arrival where our stuff sounds amazing, and then we can open up and share it with the whole world and everyone's going to love it. But the truth is, there's never that moment. So there's never that point of arrival. And you have to get in the habit early on, regardless of, how established you are, how good your mixes sound. You got to get in the habit of sharing what you're doing with others. So don't fall victim to this perfectionist mentality where, you're just kind of waiting for this moment to arrive. It's never going to come. Get in the habit of sharing what you're doing. So mistake number 5 is not knowing when to stop. So mixing is a race against time, and many people don't realize this when they're working, but your objectivity, your ability to hear a mix with fresh ears slowly fades during the mixing process. And as you start to lose this objectivity, it becomes harder to make good decisions. So over time, even the worst mix is going to start to sound good to your ears. And if you've ever mixed a track from someone else, and you've dealt with maybe someone who is too attached to their rough mix, and maybe you try to, maybe your mix sounds better, but they just can't hear it any other way because they've spent 6 months or a year listening to something in a certain way. You understand this problem, right? But we fall victim to this too as mixers. And even if you're working on your own stuff, you can easily become attached to what you have. And at that point, it becomes impossible to figure out, how to improve it. And so the bottom line is that the more time you spend on a mix doesn't necessarily make it better. This is something that I fell victim to when I first started mixing. I used to read that amazing mixers like Chris Lord-Alge and Michael Brower, all these people that I admired, finished a mix in 4 hours. And I thought, well, if they can do it in 4 hours, I can do it in 8 or 12 or 16, and I can spend 4 times as much time as they do. And that way my mixes are going to sound so much better because I'm just going to be able to really focus on the details that they missed. But I didn't realize this concept of objectivity. And so what ended up happening is my mixes sounded worse than theirs. So the key here is to get out on top. So you really want to understand that spending too much time on a mix can easily destroy it. This is such a big mistake. So there's a graph there on the right, and you can see that your progress as you move through the mixing process slows down, right? And at a certain point, you kind of reach that peak where you're not making any more progress. You want to get out on top. You don't want to keep going past that point because you can easily ruin what you've created. So when in doubt, if you're not sure whether or not you've reached this point, take a break. Step away from the mix, spend 15 or 30 minutes doing something else, come back and listen to it. And that's kind of a way to hack your objectivity and just bring back some of that lost perspective. And so that can help you determine whether or not you need to keep going or whether, enough is enough and you need to print and move on. Now, another thing you can do is save versions of your session. So just to cover your back, just in case you go down this rabbit hole and end up kind of ruining what you're doing, every hour or so, save a new version of your session. And if you're working on, if you're mixing for other people, I find it can be really helpful. Every, new version or every set of revisions you make for someone, save a new version. And that way, if they come back to you and say, hey, after 12 or 15 revisions, we really like the first one that you did, you can go back to that original version and you're not, your hands aren't tied. And really the bottom line is remember, there's no such thing as perfection. So this idea that we're just going to kind of keep going and hit this moment where everything sounds amazing, it never happens. Even the best mixers in the world are not creating music that's perfect. The goal is really to craft mixes that enhance and support the emotion and the message of the song. And so if your mix is doing that, then you don't need to keep going. So really understand that there's a point where you got to be able to recognize that you've reached the summit and get out. And I promise you, if you can learn to do this, you're going to save a ton of time and your mixes are going to sound a whole lot better. So I hope you found these 5 mixing mistakes helpful. I put together just a bonus kind of package of resources for you. If you want to check this out, you can download it for free at behindthespeakers.com/webinar. So there's a couple things I've included here. Number 1 is a free video with 7 steps to optimize your speaker and sweet spot placement. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, if you're really wondering, how do I do this on a practical level, this video is going to give you the steps to do that. And the second resource is 10 reference tracks that I use in every mix. So people ask me a lot, what are your favorite references? And these are mine that I like to compare almost every mix I do with. So check these out, and I think they'll help you achieve better sounding mixes just by having that context while you're mixing. And the last resource is 2 cheat sheets on EQ and compression. So if you're struggling with EQ and compression, which I think most people are, these cheat sheets contain tips and just tricks for approaching EQ and compression with confidence. So again, downloading these I think is really going to help you improve the way that you approach EQ and compression in your tracks. All right.
Okay. Amazing.
Cool. So I hope that's helpful to everyone.
Dude, that was awesome.
Oh, thank you so much. I feel like I was just talking to myself for like a half an hour. It's kind of weird being in like your own room here with nobody else.
It's strange. You kind of forget that you're talking to people, and
Right.
It feels like you're talking to yourself. But dude, that was awesome. It's interesting because, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but there is definitely some overlap. But we've kind of approached it differently. So I'll share mine in a second. Just wanted to quickly say we've had some really good questions. So please keep them coming. and we will be answering them at the end. You should see, so that for that free bonus content, you should see a button now just above or in the chat window. You should be able to just click get access, and I just threw that up there to make that a bit easier for everyone.
Cool.
But yeah, great stuff, man. I'd love to, maybe we could do a quick recap at the end.
Absolutely.
Shall I dive straight in?
Let's do it. I'm curious to hear your points. You get to go on the hot seat now.
Cool. I'll dive straight in then. I'll try and let's make this super.
We got a server error. I think. Why don't you guys hang tight? I'll get that link working for you. It's probably because 50 people are trying to access it right now.
Shall I dive in now? And if you want to try and see if that link can work.
Yeah, I'll get that working. Why don't you get started?
Okay, cool. So let's jump. Before I get started here, just type in the chat box. Yes, that'll do. Before I get started, just because someone said. And if you're having any server issues or anything like that, there's a button beneath the video that you should be able to see that says reconnect or refresh, something to that purpose, and you can hit that. So I'm going to go straight ahead then, and hopefully you can all hear me. I can't see the chat, so let's go ahead. Mistake number 1, only focusing on methods. And like Jason said at the beginning of his, this is going to be interesting because we're both kind of going bigger picture here. And interestingly, a lot of the questions from the webinar registration page where you signed up, and some of you were kind enough to complete that survey, and a lot of those questions were very specific, very kind of method-based things, specifics of EQ, compression, that kind of stuff. But a lot of the time, this is actually the wrong way to approach mixing. And it's the easy way to approach mixing. It's the way that feels right. You're struggling with these tools and these techniques. So it seems like that's what you should really focus on. But if you're just learning methods, it's almost like you're pretending to be a good mixer. So if you just learn all these techniques, all these tricks and tips, and you just implement them in your mixes where you think they're appropriate, you're kind of pretending. You're just doing the things that mixers do, but you're not fully understanding what's going on. So instead, you want to focus on the what and the why. And this is the key here. Instead of focusing on the methods and the how, how to EQ a kick drum, how to add compression on your mix bus. Instead, focus on the what and the why. So this is very similar to what Jason was saying about intentionality. What are you trying to achieve in this mix? What do you want to do next? What needs fixing next? Why are you about to EQ that vocal? Do you want to make it sound more aggressive? That's your why. So you reach your EQ, and now you know what to do. So that's the key here. And understanding the intention behind the moves, that's where you really start to make quick progress. That's when you're not pretending to be a mixer. This is when you're developing your own methods. You can develop your own techniques, your own tricks, your own tips, when you really understand the intention, the what you're trying to achieve, and why you're reaching for each tool. And then, of course, this does require a basic understanding of the tools available to you. So everyone has to go through that phase of really learning how to use an EQ, how to use a compressor, how to even just navigate your DAW. But once you've got that basic understanding, try to focus as much as you can on the what and the why. And that's not to say that you shouldn't focus on methods at all, because it helps, but just don't get kind of bogged down in that. Don't only focus on methods. Instead, focus on the what and the why. But with this principle in mind, the next 4 mistakes that I'm going to be sharing with you it's kind of big picture stuff. And again, going back to that idea of here, in this workshop, we just want to kind of have the biggest impacts on your mixes in the shortest time possible. And to do that, we have to focus on the bigger picture. We can't just talk about small things here. And of course, there are mistakes based on the specifics of EQ and the specifics of compression, etc. People use them wrong all the time, but these aren't crucial mistakes. The crucial mistakes are the ones that cause you to quit because you're just not getting anywhere. The crucial mistakes are the ones that stop you from ever producing mixes that you're satisfied with, that sound studio quality or better. So that's what I want to focus on for the next 4 mistakes. And this next mistake, number 2, giving into the gas. And I'm not talking about this kind of gas. I'm talking about gear acquisition syndrome. And many of you will be familiar with this term already. And I just want to make this very, very, very clear. You do not need top-end hardware, expensive plugins, and a perfect room to produce studio-level mixes, okay? It's a rabbit hole. Focusing on equipment, plugins, all this kind of stuff, it's a rabbit hole that you can fall into, and you can spend all your time doing that and no time mixing, no time practicing, no time learning skills and developing your skills. And in that process, you can waste thousands on stuff you don't need, equipment you don't need, plugins you don't need. But additionally to that, you can waste days, you can waste a ton of time looking for new microphones, new interfaces, looking for the next big thing that you think is going to suddenly take your mixes to the next level, because that thing does not exist. And you spend hours searching forums, looking at reviews, comparing hardware. You know, you're on Gearsluts all the time, and all that time is, in a sense, wasted. There does come a point where this is going to have an impact. So once you get, 80, 90% of the way to professional studio quality mixes, there is going to come a time where the plugins you're using and the hardware you're using matters. But until you're 100% sure you're at that time, don't focus on this stuff. Instead, focus on your skills. Focus on practicing and developing your skills. Only buy equipment you need. Don't just buy a new interface because you saw a good review and you think you need it. Or don't just buy a new microphone because you think it'd be nice to have a type of mic that could sound a bit different. You don't need that. Only buy equipment that you need. And that's going to help you to focus your time and your money on the things that matter. And kind of going down this theme, you can take it one step further and don't spend any money. Stick to stock plugins for a long time until you can really tell that they're holding you back, and you're ready to start buying premium plugins. You understand why you need premium plugins. If you are still blaming your bad mixes on your plugins, then to be honest, you're not ready to pay for plugins. You still need to focus on developing your skills with stock plugins. And then when you get to that point, when you're ready, start off by only buying one plugin for each type. This is a tip that I got off Jason, pretty much. It's not something that I had really considered before. I used to be really bad at this. I would always be buying plugins. But a really good way to approach this is just have one plugin for each type. So have one EQ that you go to every time. Have one compressor that you go to. This forces you to get plugins that are versatile. It forces you to learn them and really know them. And when you're in a mix, you don't spend time deciding which plugin to go for. You just grab your go-to plugin. So if you're at this point, and you're thinking about buying one compressor, one EQ for each type, I don't want to focus too much on my recommendations, but try and find plugins that are versatile. FabFilter stuff, the Waves or Renaissance stuff is brilliant for a first purchase. Those kind of plugins that are more versatile, so you can just have one for each type. And then practice using what you've already got. Get good at using the gear, the plugins you have. And when you're getting great mixes with what you have, that's when you can start to think about maybe upgrading stuff when you need it to take your mixes to that next level. So mistake number 3, not enough practice. And I see this time and time again. You spend, and this kind of leads on, you spend all the time searching for info online, learning about equipment, blah, blah, blah. But if you don't actually apply all of this information that you're learning, you'll never improve. So if you spend all your time reading books, reading blogs online, and this kind of seems counterintuitive, watching webinars like this, if you don't take what you're learning here and apply it and practice it, you're never going to improve. And you just simply can't expect your third ever mix to sound professional if you're at that point. Or even if you've done 100 mixes, but you still feel like you're not getting anywhere. It's just a time thing. Some things just come with time. And if you're not sitting down and practicing and implementing this stuff, then you're never going to improve. And I see so many people doing this. So what is the best way to practice? Well, I recommend that you sit down for 20 to 30 minutes with a particular task in mind. And depending on how dedicated you are to this stuff, you could do this every day, you could do it once a week, whenever you can spare half an hour. And that's not a lot of time, half an hour, but have a particular task in mind. Now, what do I mean by that? For example, experimenting with compression on vocals. So you load up a vocal in the context of the mix. Don't solo it. Remember that tip from Jason's presentation a second ago. Don't solo it, but then load up a compressor and think, okay, I'm just going to experiment with this. Think of something you can achieve. Say, okay, I'm going to tweak this compressor until I can make the vocal sound super thick and heavy. And then you say, right, now I've done that, I'm going to adjust the compressor until I make the vocals really punchy and aggressive. And then you just try these different things. You just experiment with it. And this is far more effective than just mixing, because if you just sit down and mix, of course, that's great. That's going to improve your workflow. That's going to improve just the general way you approach mixing. But if you sit down and practice these particular focused tasks, it's going to be a more effective use of your time. And to give you a kind of an analogy of this, you don't get good at a team sport by playing games every day. So if you want to get great at playing rugby, you don't just play a rugby game twice a week. Sure, that'd help, and I'm sure you would get you'd get good fast if you're playing 2 games a week. But you have to spend that time on focus practice and drills. Think of these as mixing drills. You're practicing something over and over again, something focused, and then when you come to a mix and it's time to actually implement this stuff and do it while you're in the throes of a mix, you just go there and you do it and you nail it. So along this line, I developed action packs with the students in my membership program, and this is a good example of focus practice. So these are just, it's just a pack where you get a video, it shows you how to do it, and then it gives you the multi-tracks and you practice it. So I wanted to kind of give you a surprise bonus here. If you head to musicianonamission.com/practice, and I should be able to just load up a little thing here for you to click on. I just wanted to kind of give that away to you guys, to say thank you for turning up live, and to give you an example here of what I'm talking about, so you can actually see how to do it. So that'll walk you through all of that if you click that link. And in that case, it's actually EQing a kick drum. So head to that link or click the button if you want an example of how to do that. And moving on now to mistake number 4. And this mistake is having a fix-it mindset. So what is a fix-it mindset? Well, have you ever thought we can fix it in the mix? I'm sure everyone's been there. Everyone, knows this phrase and knows that they should avoid it. And this mindset is a meme that will ruin your mixes. Now, I don't mean this kind of meme. I mean a meme in the traditional sense, as coined by Richard Dawkins, which is an idea, a behavior, or a style that spreads from person to person within a culture. So this fix it in the mix mindset, it's a meme that's kind of virally spread throughout our whole industry, whether you're a musician who's recording themselves or you're an engineer. It's easy to think that the mix phase is where the magic happens. And if you haven't been through this realization yet, then this is huge. Some of you watching this, you will be thinking, yeah, I know, the recording phase is more important. Mixing, you can't fix it in the mix, blah, blah, blah. But I still really want to drill this in. And if you haven't had this realization yet, then I think this is going to do huge things for you. And it's not your fault that you think that the mix phase is where the magic happens, because that's what the plugin developers want you to think. That's what some mixers want you to think. There's lots of people that want you to think that. But in fact, the reality is that a record is made way before the mix phase. So let's go back here. First of all, of course, it's the music, then it's the performance, then it's the tone of the vocalist, it's the tone of the guitar, it's the tone of the drums, the skins. After that, it's the room that you're performing in. And then, this is still the 5th or 6th thing now, we've got the recording. So this is microphone choice, microphone placement. And only after all of this, we have mixing. And arguably, it actually is the phase with the least impact. So you really need to avoid this mindset, because every recording has a best potential mix inside of it. So if you think, I'm going to fix it later, or you don't spend enough time getting the tone right when you're recording, you don't spend enough time picking the right room, trying to get a good sound in the room, picking the right mic, moving it around to get the tone you want at the source, then you're essentially reducing the potential of your mix, because every recording has a best potential mix inside of it. A poor recording is going to have a poor potential mix. An amazing recording even if someone who wasn't that good at mixing mixed it, it would sound great because the recording was amazing. So focus your energy and time on the recording phase. That's the key takeaway here. Now, moving on quickly to mistake number 5. And for me, that's not getting help. So this is how most people start. You go it alone. You decide you want to start recording yourself or something like that. And you go it alone. Maybe you do some research online, but you're still being very kind of self-motivated here. You're trying to be self-resourceful and just find some info online. But this is also why most people fail to achieve their goals, because they stay in this mindset of trying to do everything themselves and not getting outside help. And this is why I pretty much quit after 2 years, because I tried to go it alone. I tried to figure out everything for myself, and it didn't go well because mixing is not easy, and not knowing what you're doing wrong is one problem. But then also you could be intimidated by the terminology, the amount of options, etc. So you do need to get outside help. And luckily, when I quit pretty much after 2 years, somebody shared some important advice with me, and I changed my approach. I started to learn from others, and that's when I made huge progress. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to get a studio internship or go to college or get a personal mentor. They're all great things, but they all take considerable time and monetary investments. Instead, I just want you to be aware of this pitfall. And when you see opportunities to learn from people who have been through this and come out the other side, take them. Whether that's engaging with people in Facebook groups, whether that's buying books, whether that's making sure you're learning from reputable people on YouTube, that kind of stuff, or taking it one step further, getting a personal mentor. But you need to be careful that you choose wisely as well, because a lot of the time it's people giving advice that haven't been through this, or they're not out the other side yet. They haven't seen all these pitfalls and really come out the other side successful. So choose wisely who you learn from. And generally forums are kind of worth avoiding. First of all, personally, I avoid forums just because it gives me gas, right? So I'll read a review and I'm like, I want this mic, but I do not need it, so I don't buy it. But generally as well, forums are just a place where I see so much bad advice getting thrown around. So just choose wisely. And when you see opportunities to learn from someone who's been through this, take that opportunity. And you're already doing this to an extent because you're here right now. You're awesome for being here. It's great to have you all here. Like Jason was saying a second ago, it's amazing that we've got people from all over the world here. We're all teaming up to improve our mixes. So that's it from me. Over to you, Jason. So I think if you can all see and hear me, and if you want to join me again, Jason.
I don't know
and
if
we will run through some of these questions.
Can you guys, if you can see me or hear me in the chat, can you just
some new questions, because we've got quite a backlog here
in the chat and say, hey.
of questions to work through. So if you're having issues, just scanning through the chat now, if you're having issues still with anything, try refreshing the page or just refreshing the feed. Jason looks like he's just reconnecting because he might be having some issues. So I'm going to go through here and just grab a question. Ah, we've got you.
I may be back. Sorry for all the technical issues today, guys. We're that was great, Rob. Very interesting seeing the overlap, I think, between both of what we're talking about, and I think it's interesting for you guys. When you hear the same ideas coming up multiple times, I know for me, it always kind of makes me pay attention a little bit more. And so one of the reasons why we wanted to do this in a way where we weren't sharing the mistakes that we had come up with beforehand was we wanted to kind of present that opportunity to have these kind of multiple moments of things. So hopefully hearing these things come up more than once, I think should be an indication to you guys that these are, things that you really want to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. I find approaching it differently, but having the same kind of themes there, which is interesting. But I think there was quite a lot of overlap. Should we jump in now and start answering some questions?
Yeah, and I just turned my my mic down, guys. So let me know if that sounds a little bit better to you, and then we're gonna. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat box. And if you click that little icon where you write your message, you should be able to change that to a Q&A answer. and then put your question in there, and that way it'll be flagged as a question, so we can just see that in the chat box and then answer it.
Yep.
Cool.
I've got some older ones here. So if you asked your question right at the beginning, you might have to ask it again, just because I've got a bit of a, I think the chat is reduced to a certain amount of messages, but I can remember one that I'm going to start off with. So Jason, let's start with this. What would your advice be to someone who's thinking about studying music production or mixing at university? What's your kind of viewpoint on that? And do you have any recommendations?
Sure. So I went to NYU and studied recorded music. It was a 4-year university program. So I'm kind of from that camp of people who went to school for, studying. It wasn't just mixing, but it was more of a kind of overview of the music industry with engineering. And so here's what I'll say. I think we're in a very interesting time right now, because there are so many schools that are accepting students to put them through engineering programs, but a lot of the opportunities to work in studios and positions have kind of dried up because a lot of these big studios have closed. So you have these schools who are just kind of churning out graduates, but there's really nowhere for them to go. So in terms of the practical kind of knowledge and experience that you need to be able to craft great sounding music, I think that there might have been a time when going to school was the best option to really get that information. But today, I think we're in a world where there's so much available on the internet. I mean, there's these webinars, things like that. Obviously, what we're doing is trying to share as much of what we've learned with you guys. But I think there's no longer a monopoly on the information in terms of being able to learn how to create great sounding mixes and records. So if that's what you want, if you want to figure out how do I make music that sounds really good, I don't think that going to a university is the only way to do it. I think you got to have discipline to be able to go out there and really study this stuff and approach it like a job, and sometimes for some people, I think having the structure of a formal education can be helpful. So if you're one of those people, you might maybe want to consider that path. But for someone like, I think myself, I think I learned as much from going out, on the internet and reading and watching stuff like this and just experimenting and practicing, like Rob said. The other thing I'll say is it's not just about the education. I think for me, what was really helpful was the relationships and the connections that I built through my education. So some of my first clients were students that were fellow classmates of mine. I found my manager through one of my professors who has become a mentor to me. And that would have never happened if I didn't, or maybe it would have in another way, but I wouldn't have had access to that if I didn't go to a university. So that's the kind of trade-off. I think you have to think about it, not just in terms of the information, but also the value of the relationships. But, is it worth taking on thousands and thousands of dollars of debt? I think is a whole nother conversation. And so you really have to weigh those pros and cons. I know that's not a kind of simple answer, but I wanted to give the whole breadth of what we're kind of talking about here. What do you think, Rob?
I completely agree. I mean, first of all, I went to university to study this, and it was not beneficial, to be honest. It was pretty disappointing. Everything I've learned has been from other sources, or everything valuable that I've learned has been from other sources. And then secondly, just wanted to add there as well that it completely depends on your intention. If you want to be a freelance mix engineer, then maybe it'll help, but you can start doing that right away. You can learn through experience. You can learn from doing work. If you just want to record your own music and you're primarily a musician, probably not worth going to university to study. So just kind of think about your intentions there as well. So there was a question we had earlier about glue. How to create glue in a mix? I think that would be a fun one to address.
Sure. So do you want to start with that, or do you want me to start?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it short. I mean, for me personally, glue it could be a number of things. Dynamically, you could, mix bus compression is going to be important there, just to get some kind of cohesion between the sources. reverb as well. Even just very subtle reverb can help to put everything in one space, and this, make sure in that case you're using reverbs on effects buses and using sends, so you're creating kind of like a cohesive space. I don't want to go into too much depth here because I could start to talk about tonality and that kind of stuff, but just to briefly touch on that, how about you?
I agree. Both those things, mixed bus compression and reverb, are the first things that I think of when I think about glue. I'll give a different answer. Sometimes glue is not always a good thing. And there's a balance, I think, between, on one hand, creating separation and clarity so that each track feels like it has its own kind of space in the mix, and then on the other hand, creating glue where everything kind of feels like it's kind of together as one thing. And to a certain extent, I think it depends on the genre. Like there are certain genres, like hip hop, for example, that tend to lean more on the side of separation and clarity than on glue. Whereas like a rock mix, you might want more of that glue and that kind of cohesion. So I think it varies depending on the genre that you're working with, and you should think about it differently depending on the context of the song and the genre that you're working in.
Yeah, completely agree. Okay, have you seen any that you want to address?
Yeah, I saw one here. Let me see. So Carl said, and I want to talk about this a little bit because I think it's important. So Carl said, you listen to a great reference track. The kick is huge, modern, and awesome. How to figure out how they got that and replicate it in the home studio. So I want to take a step back here and maybe use this question to talk a little bit about the referencing process more on like a practical level. Like, how do you listen to references? How do you use them to guide your decisions? What are you listening for? How do you like incorporate them into your mixing process? So why don't you start and then I'll jump in.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, references are kind of a guideline, right? You're not trying to copy it. This is why I think it's important to use a couple, use a few in the same genre, first of all, because it's going to vary so much from genre, but you're just trying to get more kind of a point of reference, the clues in the name. You're not trying to replicate entirely, because if your kick drum doesn't sound huge, modern, and awesome when it was recorded, you're not going to be able to make it sound huge, modern, and awesome. It's probably because it sounded that way when they tracked it. It was a kick drum that sounded great. So you can never copy it exactly. It's just to kind of guide you in the right direction. Make sure you're not going too heavy on the low end, too heavy on the top end, to help you make kind of more stylistic decisions. So if you don't work with rock music a lot and then you pull in a rock mix, you want to use a rock reference. So, okay, the snare's got to be way louder than I thought it'd be, that kind of stuff. So it is hard to replicate in a home studio, but it starts kind of before. If you want to get that sound that you're hearing on that record, it kind of starts before the mixing phase. I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get across here. How about you?
Well, I think a couple of things you said there, I just want to kind of hammer in. The first is using more than one reference. I think that's an incredibly important point, because if you're just listening to one reference, I think the problem is you end up copying a lot of the time that one reference. And what you're really looking for when you're referencing is more of kind of a broader context. So by having multiple references to compare your mix with, I think it avoids this kind of problem where you end up steering your mix in a direction just depending on what that one reference might sound like. Because when we're referencing, our goal is we're not trying to copy the reference. And as soon as you start doing that, you're going to end up leading yourself in the wrong direction. So the goal is really just to kind of get a broad overall impression of what the mix sounds like. So when I'm listening to references, I'm not really zeroing in on, what does the kick sound like? I'm more thinking like, okay, what's the overall tonal balance of the mix? Is my mix brighter or duller? Is it, where's the kind of, it's like a real quick kind of impression of the reference. I'm not like really zeroing in on the fine details, because you're never gonna, you don't want to copy, because your mixes, they're different tracks. And so the choices that you're gonna have to make are different. So to me, just reading into that question a little bit, I think you're maybe getting a little bit too granular with the way that you're listening to references. And I would recommend just kind of taking a step back and approaching the referencing process just as a whole. And again, what Rob said, I think listening, bringing in multiple references will help you do that, because that way you're not going to be swayed by what one specific reference sounds like. So I guess maybe not to answer, I don't want to avoid your question directly, but I more so just kind of bring up a point that I think is so important when you're thinking about references.
Yeah, 100%. I've seen a couple of questions about panning. So I was just going to address that quickly if you're happy for me to go ahead on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So panning is a hard one because I think the question was, is there a standard for panning instruments? Which there isn't. So everyone approaches panning differently. And it's something not a lot of people talk about a lot because it seems simple maybe or obvious, but anyway, just my kind of approach to panning. You may be familiar with LCR panning, which is left, center, right. So that's just to get really nice separation. You only pan hard left, dead center, or hard right. I think that's a great approach. If you're not used to it, it might sound odd at first, but just remember that is how a lot of people mix. When you hear songs on the radio, a lot of them are panned that way. So that case, you might have, and these are the standards: vocals always in the center, lead vocals, not always, but generally, kick, snare, bass, that kind of stuff, fundamentals in the middle, and then guitars, backing vocals, additional parts on the outside. What I like to then do is adding one or two parts that are panned 50% of the way either side, just to fill in those gaps, because sometimes with LCR panning it sounds a bit too wide and you're not really making full use of the stereo field. So maybe like a shaker pan 50% left and like a guitar pan 50% right or something like that. There's a video on YouTube that I did about this called 50/50 panning, so check that out if you want to go into a bit more depth on that. What's your approach, Jason? I think it's kind of similar, right?
Yeah, so to be honest, I don't get too obsessed with the panning and stuff. And here's why. So people, we forget that most people don't listen to music the way that we listen to music. So if you're, in your studio, maybe your monitors are set up, perfectly left and right. And so you're hearing this beautiful stereo image. But if you go into most people's, living rooms and you see like there's one speaker in the bedroom and one in the dining room. And I mean, most people, the whole concept of like hearing a stereo image, I think we get way too obsessed with this. So when I think about how to create clarity and separation, I think it's much more important to rely on tonal differences between tracks. So there was somebody that mentioned, mixing in mono, yes or no. That was a question. I think mixing in mono can be incredibly helpful because what you're doing is you're summing your mix, down to one speaker, right? So everything's you're not hearing the panning at all. And so that forces you to create separation between tracks using tonal differences versus relying on panning. Because let's say two tracks in your mix are fighting with each other. And so you pan one to one side and one to the other. And so, yeah, when you're sitting right in front of the speakers, now they sound clearer. You can hear both of them. But what happens when you step back 5 feet from the speakers? And so now you're kind of listening to your mix in pseudo mono, and those tracks are fighting with each other again. So to me, when I think about, how to create clarity and separation between tracks, I rely a lot more on tonal differences than panning. And so oftentimes panning is kind of an afterthought. I mean, I'm not that I'm not focusing on it, but I don't get real obsessed with these little micro movements of, 5 degree off to the left. And it's not how people are listening to music. And so, that's my 2 cents on that.
I don't know how long you spend on it, but for me, it'll be like 5-10 minutes tops.
Yeah, it's an afterthought. I mean, if something's in the way, I try to get things out of the way of the center, if I can. But I don't really have, I don't get too crazy with it. Because again, it doesn't, oftentimes it's not going to translate in a real life listening situation. I'd rather focus on creating separation with tonal differences and EQ.
Yeah. Great. And I actually have a question here that I think would be perfect for you, because I know you love talking about this kind of stuff, Jason. So Daniel asked, and it's quite a big question, so it might have to be like a summary.
Okay.
But Daniel asked, could you describe your mindset when you're mixing? How do you start and what is the prep before you start mixing? These are the most overlooked but important aspects. So
agree 100%, Daniel. I think one of the big things that separates amateur mixers from pros is the way they approach the prep process, and really having a system and a kind of solid approach for the prep process. So the first thing I would say is if you don't have a formal process for approaching mix prep before you start mixing, I'd say that's a big mistake. I would definitely try to formalize that process. So a couple things that I do, and I'll just go through them very briefly. I try to consolidate decisions as much as possible before I start mixing. So I try to get the track counts down as small as I can by bouncing tracks down and almost like creating little like mini mixes, while at the same time trying to retain as much control as I can. So the less tracks I have to work with going into the mix, the better. So that's kind of a core part of my prep process. The other thing that I do is something that I don't think a lot of people do during the prep process, but I find it really helpful. And it's basically, I go through each track in my mix and I sweep an EQ boost up the frequency spectrum. And this is the only time that I will ever listen to tracks in solo. But I try to find resonances or just ugly frequencies on the individual tracks in my mix, and then I pull them out. And the way I kind of describe this is it's almost like, if you're cooking like a soup or something, you have all your vegetables and all the ingredients, and you clean them up before you start. So you cut off the stalks and you wash them, and so this is like I'm preparing all of the individual tracks in my session for mixing. And I find that by doing this, by kind of cleaning things up and getting rid of these problem frequencies before I start, the mix comes together much more quickly, and I don't have to solo anything during the mixing process.
And just to develop that analogy a bit more, you can spend just as much time chopping as cooking, right? So
absolutely. It's more time. I'll say that. Oftentimes the prep process takes as long as the mix. Like I spend more time doing that than I do mixing sometimes.
Yeah. And I think that's just a really important point to make, because even talking about this stuff, you might think, oh, okay, I need to spend more time just organizing my tracks, but it's so much more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there's another question here that I really want to address.
Please.
Duke said, is EQing in 3 dB increments the general rule for boosting or cutting?
I love this one.
And no, not at all. And I think this goes back to that thing of being intentional, right? Not worrying about methods. Definitely not listening to rules. If anyone ever tells you a rule, like a very specific rule, because you can have like kind of bigger picture rules, but like a very specific, like don't do this exact thing with this tool. It's just don't listen because it's not true at all. And it goes back to that thing of thinking about what you're trying to achieve and why. Because if you pull up a snare drum and you're like, right, I want this mix to sound like a really kind of old school aggressive rock mix. That's why I need this snare to sound in your face and snappy. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make it sound in your face and snappy. You pull up your EQ and you do that. Whatever it takes, whether it takes a 10 dB boost with a high shelf at 5 kilohertz, like even something as crazy as that. If that's what it takes, do it. There are no rules, definitely not 3 dB. I mean, there are situations when if you're really not sure and you just want to make subtle moves, then 3 dB is kind of like maybe a good guideline of if you don't want to kind of go over the top. But then that's also contextual, because 3 dB on the mix bus is going to make a huge difference. So to answer your question, no, it's not the general rule. Bingo. Anything to add to that?
No, 100%. So I think it really boils down to, again, what I was talking about, having an intention for every move you make. And so if we go back to that idea of mixing as problem solving and kind of what you were talking about, like you have a sound in your head for what you want a track to sound like, then the process is secondary. How you get there doesn't matter. And so people get caught up in these rules, of, I should only EQ 3 dB. And what I really think that is saying is I'm not aiming towards anything, right? And so I'm trying to kind of cover my back by having this rule so I don't make the wrong decisions. But if you have an intention, if you're aiming towards a goal, if you have an idea of what you want things to sound like, then it's just about, how do I get there? How do I get that sound, and do whatever it takes to get there? Sometimes that means being aggressive. Sometimes it means being subtle, but the rules are not going to help, because sometimes, you got to be more aggressive than that. And that's okay. I mean, I remember one of the first things I learned in audio school, and I had a great, one of my teachers was a amazing, Grammy-winning jazz engineer. And you'd think jazz, right, is known for its subtlety. And I remember the first day of class, we walked in and we had this beautiful console, this API console, and we'd start mixing and I'd grab an EQ and like add like 2 dB or something, and he'd be like, "Why are you doing that? Like grab the EQ and crank it by like 15 dB." And this was like a jazz, Grammy-winning jazz mixer, and he was right because and oftentimes the best way to figure out whether or not a decision is the right one or not is to go overboard and hear what that sounds like. And so if we're constantly just tiptoeing through the mixing process and making all these subtle moves, how do we know whether or not the moves are the right moves to make? You're mixing scared. And so I would say it's much better to be bold, grab things, tweak the knobs, and then find out, wow, that doesn't sound good at all, and just take it off versus just tiptoeing and not really doing anything.
Yep, completely agree. There's another question here that I thought would be a good one to address. What's the first instrument you would start with when you open up the session?
Well, it depends. There's a couple different approaches to starting a mix. A lot of people start, with the kick, and they'll build a mix up from the foundation. What I like to do, and something that I think is common between us, is actually bringing everything in and getting a good rough mix going before you really start to zero in on any one area of the mix. Because again, going back to this idea of mixing is all about making everything fit together. It's all about that context of how tracks fit together. When we start to zero in on one track early on in the mix, we have no idea how that track relates to the rest of the tracks in our mix. So if you solo a kick drum and spend an hour EQing the kick drum, how do you know what that kick drum needs to sound like? You may not even want that kick drum to be in the mix at all. You may mute it later on. So I think the best approach is to get all the tracks in playing together and just get a rough mix going. And then you have that context. You're seeing how everything's fitting together with everything else. And that's going to help you make decisions that really make everything sound good together as a whole, which is the whole point of the mixing process.
Yeah. And just to add to that, as soon as you open up the session, we've kind of like skipped a whole phase here, going back to that prep phase. If you're opening a session, that's normally going to come first. But then also, that idea of getting a rough volume balance and then maybe starting with mix bus or the most important thing, I think is great. But even then, we can go one level deeper. And when you're pulling the faders up, personally, I like to start with the most important thing. So I'm just talking about volume balancing here, not even plugins. This is literally, okay, you've prepped the mix and now it's time to get a volume balance going. Just pull up whatever's most important first, vocal. And this is just for a second, just to give you a kind of reference point. So you set this to 0 on your channel and then you bring everything else up around it. So to kind of go one level deeper there.
Cool. So there's a question here I want to chat about a little bit, because I actually think we have different views on this, and so I think it'll be interesting for them to get both perspectives. So let's talk about mixing with headphones. So what's your perspective on that? What are some maybe tips or strategies? How do you feel about that in general?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just to make it clear, again, this goes back to like there are no rules. Of course, you can produce great mixes on headphones, right? There's a lot of people out there that will tell you you can't. And that's just simply not true. Of course you can. Having said that, it will be harder. And I think that's the key thing here. A lot of people think, okay, you can't mix on headphones. You can, but it's not going to be as easy as if you sat in a perfectly treated room with a great set of monitors, because then you're going to be able to hear every single move so clearly. Every time you do like a tiny little dB cut boost, you're going to hear it. But if you're in a situation where you don't have those things, so if you're someone who records at home, which most people watching will be, and you're not in a purpose-built room, and it's not perfectly treated, these are things that you should work towards. One day it'd be, it's a great idea to treat your room. You should definitely do that. But in the interim, mixing on headphones can be a great way to remove the room from the equation completely, because then you're on a more level playing field with a professional studio. Your room is the main thing holding you back. So if you have monitors, mix on monitors and combine that with headphone mixing. Put on headphones to check the low end. Put on headphones just as another system to listen through, to give you a fresh perspective. if you are in a situation where you can only mix on headphones, first of all, try to get out of that situation. Try to get some good monitors and treat your room, which doesn't have to cost a fortune. But then in the meantime, first of all, mix quietly, mix much quieter than you think you should, because you'll get FT quicker. Quicker. So casual speaking level or lower. Use references. That's going to be really important. Take regular breaks. There's not a huge world of difference between mixing on the two. You just have to approach it slightly differently. What's I know you do have a different view on this. So.
Well, look, and this is an important point, before I get into, look, there's no one right way to approach things. And so, what we're saying is not, either of us, we have perspectives and opinions on these things, and they're not gospel. So, my opinion on this personally is I've done a lot of, early on when I was first starting mixing, especially when I was in college, and working in, dorm rooms and trying desperately to figure out a way to make headphones work. I never was able to do that. And I tried, different tools. This was before like Waves NX and some of these newer tools came out. So I haven't had a chance to try some of those. And for those who don't know Waves NX, it's essentially a plugin that allows, it helps you kind of emulate the sound of listening on a pair of speakers. So I haven't tried it yet, but it looks interesting. I think there are some fundamental differences between mixing on speakers and headphones. When you're listening on headphones, you're not getting the crosstalk, meaning when you're listening to speakers in a real room, the left speaker is kind of hitting your left ear, but it's also hitting the right ear a little bit. So you get this kind of blending of sounds. You're also hearing the sound bouncing off the walls. It's just a different experience. So in practice, what I found is the mixes that I did on headphones never really sounded that great on speakers. They sounded good on headphones, but when I played them on speakers, the low end would sound kind of weird, and balances weren't quite there. And I tried a lot of stuff to try to make it work, but I was just never able to do that. So what I found was, and I know a lot of you are probably working in less than ideal listening environments, whether it's a home studio or bedroom or something. I think combining, like Rob was saying, combining monitors with headphones and learning how to use them both to kind of counteract some of the deficiencies in your listening environment can be helpful. So, for example, Rob mentioned checking the low end on headphones. I think that's a great strategy, because oftentimes in a bedroom or a home studio, the low end is going to be kind of off. So getting that kind of second reference check of headphones where you're not hearing the sound of your room can give you a flatter low end response. I think doing the majority of the mix on speakers is still a good idea, and then using the headphones as kind of a secondary reference point is what I've found to be the most helpful. I still use headphones as a part of the mixing process, but I think for me, I've just found that I get the best results when I do the majority of the mix on studio monitors. Even in a less than ideal listening environment, I still think it's better than mixing on headphones exclusively. That's just kind of what I've found works best for me.
I've got another question here, which I know we're also going to slightly disagree on. I think this is a fun, a fun theme to continue. Justin, do you use EQ on the master fader?
Yeah, so I guess he means like the mix bus. Sure, absolutely. I think a couple of things I'll say about that. You have to be careful. And the main thing that I'll say is you don't want to try to fix problems on the mix bus. So if you find yourself really digging into an EQ on the mix bus, it's a good indication that you probably need to go back to your mix and address those problems within the mix. So sometimes, for example, if you're cutting a ton of low end on the mix bus, it's a good chance there's problems on individual tracks that you need to address, because you got to remember that when you do something on the mix bus, it affects every track in your session. So if there's only 2 or 3 tracks that are causing a problem, there's no need to cut out that frequency on the entire mix, and it's way too heavy-handed. So I tend to use master fader EQ or mix bus EQ, but it's gentle. It's more of kind of an overall shaping thing, and sometimes I don't use it, and I know a lot of mixers that don't use it at all. So it depends on the process. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I completely agree. not fixing problems, I think, is like the key thing here, because it's so tempting. I think muddiness is probably a common one. I definitely think there are situations when, you know, a bit of subtle cutting to remove muddiness works on the mix bus. But if you find yourself digging in, yes, go and address the things that are problematic. It's going to be guitars, the upper end of the bass, vocals, that kind of stuff. But for me personally, just to pick up on something you said there about not using it on every mix, I think where we differ is perhaps I think that it's a really good way of getting big wins early on for boosting your confidence. Being really efficient with like one move, one plugin on your mix bus, you can do a lot of I don't want to say heavy lifting, because that might give the impression that you're being aggressive with it, but you can get a lot of the kind of the tonality into the right direction. So I think where we differ probably is that personally I would use it on every mix because it's one of the first things I do. And there's never been a mix when I've thought, you know what, it doesn't need it. So that's probably where we differ. And again, this just goes to show that there isn't one way of doing this.
Yeah, and that's a great approach too. The whole top-down approach, what Rob's talking about, starting, doing the initial processing on your mix bus and then moving backwards. I mean, most people start a mix by processing individual tracks, but what he's talking about, I think, is a really great approach. So starting your processing on the mix bus, once you already have a rough mix, you're EQing and compressing there first, and then moving backwards to maybe group tracks like your drum subgroup, and then moving backwards to the individual tracks at the end of the line, I think can be a great technique. So, it's something that I would definitely recommend too. I agree. Big wins. You're going to use less processing. You're just going to get to the finish line faster a lot of the time if you do follow that approach. So definitely, 100%.
And I think thanks for elaborating on that, because that was another question, top-down mixing. So that was kind of a rough overview there. And there's not that much more to it. It's literally just, starting from the top and working your way down. If you want to learn a bit more about that, I think we've both got other videos and tutorials.
Yeah, you probably have better resources than I do on that, because I haven't talked about it as much, but I know it's like a core tenet in kind of the way that you approach mixing.
So I think it was David. If you want to learn more about that, go check out. There's a YouTube. I keep saying YouTube on video. A video on YouTube called Slow Focus Mixing, and that's going to give you a bit more information. But I think now we could move on to another question. Oh, this could be a good one. How do you deal with clients who send you badly recorded stuff?
Like every day, you mean? So first of all, I think I just want to be clear that there's this myth that I think people have that once you reach like a certain level, and I'm not saying I'm like a mid-level mixer, but there's like top tier guys, and I guess I have the benefit of knowing some of them, and there's this idea that people have that once you reach the kind of upper echelons, you're no longer getting badly recorded tracks. Totally not true. Even the best mixers in the world are getting badly recorded stems all the time. So the first thing is just recognize that it's kind of part of the process. There's a couple different ways I approach it. Number one, it depends on the relationship that I have with the client. Like if I'm really close to them and I can say, hey, this is good, but it's kind of distorted, or hey, it would be better if you just re-recorded this. Sometimes I might be able to say that. And again, the whole goal is we're partners, right? I'm working with them to help them achieve the best sounding record possible. So I wouldn't be afraid of approaching your client and just the way that you frame it as, look, it's totally up to you, but here's my feedback. And if you want to take this, we can look, I'm going to make it work either way, but I think it'll be better if you re-recorded it, but also recognize that they're thinking about other things that you're thinking about. So they're thinking about the performance, right? And they may love the performance, and maybe the recording isn't that great, but the performance is awesome. And so you just have to work with it. I mean, all the standard techniques, specialty tools, multi-band compression, isotope, de-distortion, declip, there's all these great tools, but I think it's more the mindset of like, look, your job is to make it work. So don't complain, make it work, whatever it is. And sometimes you got to deal with crappy sounding tracks. That's just what it is. If you're recording your own stuff, there's no excuse for that. You should you should be recording really good sounding tracks. But sometimes you get stuck with stuff that doesn't sound good. Maybe, you know, the performance is great. I mean, I would always err on the side of the performance. You know, if the performance sounds great and the sound of the track isn't getting in the way, if it isn't so bad that it's distracting from the performance itself, then make it work. That's my point of view.
I think this is really where the people skills come into it as well, because it in that moment when maybe you're sending revisions over and you're not getting the kind of positive feedback that you're hoping for, and in that moment it can be really frustrating, and you might feel like saying, well, the stems are crap, it's not my fault. But these are the kind of situations where it's all about the people skills, and it's important because this is a big part of it. So just learning how to deal with this on a technical level and on a people skills level is just an important part of developing.
100%. And it's really about the people skills at the end of the day. I just want to nail this in. Regardless, I mean, I know most of you guys are probably mixing your own material. Maybe you're not dealing with clients, but even if you're working with, you know, your band or at a certain point, you gotta really be able to develop those skills. And there's a million people out there that can craft great sounding mixes, but what really is going to separate you is your ability to communicate and move effectively through the mixing process with others.
Yeah. Okay. I'll ask, how long should it take you to mix a track, knowing when to stop?
Why don't you start with that one?
Yeah. So this is a question that comes up a lot. So many people seem to struggle with this. Like, how do I know when a mix is finished? And there's not a time, it's not so much a time-based question as much as a workflow-based question, right? Because one mixer will take 2 or 3 hours to mix, and then someone else will take, I don't know, 10 hours. People are different, so there's not like a time that I can give you. What I will say is that it's much more to do with workflow, and once you have a workflow in place, that helps you to know when the mix is finished. And what I mean by that is, if you have, you know, you have your like prep workflow where you pull in your tracks, you organize them, you do all your prep stuff, and then you have an approach to mixing, and maybe the approach for the tracks that you've got now is this kind of top-down approach where you are starting with the mix bus, and then after you've done the mix bus, you do group buses, and then you focus on smaller details like individual channels like the kick drum, the snare, and then after that, maybe you're focusing on effects and then automation, and you slowly work to these fine details. You get to a point where you've gone through and you've done everything. You don't spend, you know, hours EQing a tambourine part. You kind of go through the motions. Almost.
You mean you don't do that? Every tambourine I get, it takes at least a couple of hours. I must be doing something wrong,
man. Yeah, but then once you've gone through that workflow, and then for me, after doing that, it's like, you know, writing a list, taking a break, and then coming back, writing a list of things that need fixing, going through that list once or twice tops. Because when you have a workflow and you've been through it several times, you then know when you're coming to an end of the mix. You know when you're going too far, because that's a very risky thing, and that happens a lot. You overmix, you go too far if you don't have a set kind of workflow. So I think once you have that in place, that will help you to know when you're finished mixing, and you'll get a feel for when you're going too far. And also just making sure you don't spend too long on things. Like if you find that you're adjusting an EQ on a snare for like 5 or 10 minutes, it's probably a sign that, you know, you didn't have an initial gut instinct.
You got to go outside.
Go outside, move on to something else.
Breathe.
Yeah. Anything to add to that?
Well, something you just said that I kind of want to expand upon is a technique that is kind of a core part of my process. So one of my mentors, who's an incredible mixer, his name's Bob Power, is really foundational for me because he really helped inform a lot of the way that I approach the mixing process. And he taught me this technique. And basically the whole idea is every time you come back from a break where maybe you haven't heard your mix for half an hour, or maybe it's a new day and you're just sitting down and listening to your mix for the first time, it's kind of this golden moment, right? Because you're hearing the mix with fresh ears, right? You have this kind of window of perspective that you wouldn't normally have. And so what most people do is they sit down, they listen to the mix, and then as soon as they hear something that they don't like, a problem, they stop playback and they go immediately to fix that problem. And so what ends up happening is, okay, you fix that problem, right? But you've blown your moment of objectivity on that one issue. And so you end up not taking advantage of that perspective that you have. So what he taught me to do, and this is what I do all the time now, is whenever you come back, sit down, grab a notebook and a pen, and listen to your track from start to finish and write down all of the things that you don't like. And don't stop when you hear a problem. Listen from the beginning to the end. That's the key here. And make a list of all the things that you want to change. And so now you have this list, right? And you can go and you can tackle these things one by one. And so you've made the most of that little window of perspective and those fresh ears that you have. And so what I find is that, when I'm finished, I can listen to it from start to finish and nothing really sticks out. Nothing bugs me. There isn't anything on that list. And so after doing this a handful of times, there's just nothing left to fix. And that's when I know I'm done. It's that simple, because for me, it's really, I think about mixing as problem solving. And when there are no problems left to solve, there's nothing left to do. It's that simple.
That's when you start tweaking and go down that rabbit hole of, it's not perfect, but you keep working on it because it's never going to be perfect.
Right, 100%. And so that technique alone has saved me hours. It's much more efficient. If I wish I could show you my notebooks. I just have these thick notebooks full of mixing notes, because this is what I do every single time I mix. And it's just a great technique.
Completely agree. Should we do, if we've got time for one more?
Yeah, we'll do a couple more and then we'll head off. I love doing this stuff, so I don't know about you. And I'm glad, so many of you guys have stuck around here. So I just want to say, I hope you found this helpful, and our goal really is to try to help you as much as we can.
Yeah. So I've seen a couple about gain staging. Do you want to start on that?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is I put out a video not too long ago about this. So if you go to search behind the speakers in YouTube, there's a gain staging video that covers this. There are 3 basic rules to gain staging. First, don't clip the mix bus. That's probably the most obvious one. You want to make sure that you're always leaving enough headroom on the mix bus. And so many people say, how much headroom should I leave? Should I be aiming for -8 or -10? It doesn't matter. As long as you don't clip, you're fine. People get so obsessed with this. You can always add more level later using a limiter if you're too quiet. So I would say aim on the side of too quiet and make up the difference later with a limiter. So you should be well below 0. The second thing is you want to optimize the level going into your plugins as well. And this is something that people don't think about a lot. So a lot of plugins, specifically the ones that model analog gear, are designed to be hit at a certain level. So like, for example, in the analog world, 0 VU was like you wanted to aim at 0 VU, which was a certain level that you would hit all of your compressors and EQs at. And that way you were getting the most out of those pieces of gear. But because these plugins replicate a lot of these analog pieces of gear, they are designed to be hit at the same kind of level as 0 VU, which in the digital world is around -18 dB full scale. So that's average. That's not peak. So your peaks can go a little higher than that. But I'd say, if you're aiming around -18 dB, so you want to hit your plugins at that level, you're going to get the best performance out of your individual plugins. Now, it varies sometimes depending on the plugin, but something you want to pay attention to. And the third rule of gain staging, I won't say rule, it's more of a guideline, is you want to try to keep your faders close to 0. So the idea is that the faders in most DAWs are designed so that basically they give you the most control when they're parked right around 0. So if you, for example, if your fader is right around 0 and you just grab your mouse and kind of push it up a little bit, maybe that fader will turn up by like 0.2 dB or 0.5 dB. But if your fader's pulled all the way down to -30 and you make that same move on your mouse, it might jump up by 1 dB or 2 dB. So you have a lot less what's called resolution when your faders are turned down that low. So by keeping your faders close to zero, it's going to give you a lot more flexibility and control as you move through the mixing process. So you can do this using a gain plugin. So for example, if your fader is turned down by -30, just add a gain plugin. And then in that plugin, you can turn the track down by -30, and then you can bring your fader back up to 0. And so that's kind of a hack. And again, this is not going to affect the sound of the mix, but it's more of like a workflow hack that will help you move through the mixing process with more flexibility.
Yeah. And a couple of things just to add to that. First of all, when you're recording, it's the same. You aim for that same kind of sweet spot, -18. So monitor in your DAW and adjust the trim until you're seeing around that kind of averaging. You just have to eyeball it. And that's the other thing I wanted to stress with this, is that you don't have to be too accurate, because I know in the past I've said to people, -18 is kind of the sweet spot, especially if you're using like a lot of saturation plugins, that kind of stuff, where it's very much based on the level coming into the plugin. But then they spend hours at the beginning of every mix, like making sure like the RMS of like every channel is exactly -18. So the other thing, even though that is the sweet spot, you don't have to worry about it too much. Personally, I just eyeball it. And if there's any channels that don't have much headroom, if they're peaking higher than like -10, or between -6 and -10, I just pull the gain down a bit. And then you just want to check, if you're using group auxes as well, check that the gain's good on there, because sometimes you have to cut going into the group aux. If it's like a backing vocals group and you've got like 20 backing vocals going on, you send them all to one group bus, that group bus is going to become a lot hotter. So then sometimes as the first plugin, you need to add a trim plugin there and cut a few dBs. So yeah, just maintaining headroom. And then if you are using saturation amp simulation, then -18 is worth thinking about more. Otherwise, it's just kind of, again, like a guideline, a kind of just a rough point to aim towards.
Yeah, agreed. I think people get a little tweaky here with the gain staging stuff. It's important. Yeah. I'm not saying it's not important. It's definitely important. But
And this moves on. I saw another question about how loud should the mix be, and I think, first of all, to address kind of this in two ways. First of all, before mastering, or before you're putting a limiter on it, it really doesn't matter, again, as long as you've got that headroom. If it's peaking at -3, it's the same as if it's peaking at -25. It's just numbers, right? It's ones and zeros. But if you're hitting -1, -2, that's when it's getting a bit too close for comfort. So you just want to make sure on your mix bus you've got headroom, and that's the important thing. Just try and have 5-10 dBs of headroom. But then when you're mastering it yourself, if you're not sending that off to a mastering engineer, in terms of volume, and I don't want to go into this too much because I could talk for ages about dynamic range and the importance of that, but just don't squash your tracks. You don't need them to be super loud. So many platforms now, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, I think SoundCloud as well, they volume match. So if you upload a mix that's too quiet, they'll turn it up a bit for you. And then equally, there's these top 10 artists who are putting out these loud squash mixes. They're uploading them to these services and they're getting turned down in volume, and now they don't sound anywhere near as good because they don't have that dynamic range. So just a kind of a quick guideline there. Generally, if you're mastering your own track, I'd recommend just pulling up a limiter and going for 2 dB of gain reduction, maybe 3. But if you push it more than that, you're getting into kind of territory where you need to start comparing it, thinking about it more. But I find generally just putting a limiter as the last plugin on your mix bus, turning up the input gain until you're seeing 2 or 3 dB of gain reduction, that's going to be loud enough to compete on these services.
Yeah, so the loudness thing is very interesting. So something that you said, I just want to hammer in again, because it's so important, because this is a fundamental shift that's happening right now, and that's been happening over the last few years. So all of these services are now incorporating loudness normalization by default. So if your music is on Spotify, if it's on YouTube, basically the way these services are working now is that they automatically compensate for the different levels of all the different tracks, so that the listener doesn't have to change the volume knob between different videos. So what that means is that there's no point in slamming your mixes and making them super loud anymore, because they're just going to get turned down. So first of all, realize that this is a fundamental shift, and it means that maybe the loudness wars aren't over completely, but they're certainly on their way out. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I'll just to add to what you said, every mix has like a loudness potential. And it really depends on a lot of things. It depends on the arrangement, depends on the instrumentation. Like, for example, EDM tracks can often get pushed a little bit more because that's that distortion that we get when we add a bunch of limiting to things doesn't sound as bad on like an EDM mix or a bunch of synths as it would on like an acoustic guitar or something that's a little bit more organic. So some of it depends on kind of the track that you're working on. So you just want to make sure that you're considering the material you're working with, and don't try to push something more than it can go. The other thing I think that can be super helpful when you're thinking about loudness is making sure that you're always enabling a feature on your limiter called loudness compensation or loudness normalization. And so basically how this works is on most limiters, the way most limiters work by default is when you turn up the limiter and when you add more gain into the limiter, your track gets louder. And so this is a really bad way to figure out how much limiting you need, because as you turn the limiting up, the track gets louder, it sounds a little bit better to your ears, and so you end up over limiting a lot of the time. But if you turn on loudness normalization or compensation, it's called different things on different limiters. Essentially what it does is it links the input and the output gain. And so as you turn the limiter up, the output turns down. And so there's no increase in level as you add more limiting. And so this makes it really easy to figure out when enough is enough, because you're going to hear your mix start to sound distorted and smaller, and then you need to back off. So making sure that you're always using that feature, which is at this point included in most limiters, I think can be a really great way to make sure you make the right decisions when it comes to loudness in the mastering process.
And you can replicate that if you're using stock plugins, and this is going to tie in quite nicely to the next question, because if your stock limiter in your DAW doesn't have a loudness matching feature, you can just put a trim plugin after it. And this is something that you have to do with some plugins. If they don't have some kind of loudness matching or a way you can adjust the output gain, you can just put a trim plugin after it. And then you just have to like play, pause, bypass them both, play, pause, bring them both back in. And you can still then compare at the same volume.
Yeah, but doing that is so important because people over limit. I mean, this is the biggest mistake we make. We spend 12 hours on a mix, and then we slam it into a limiter, and in 2 seconds we've ruined all of the work that we've done. So, I mean, you got to be so careful with limiting. And I think what Rob just said, comparing and A/Bing and making sure you're always you're not making things sound worse, I think is half the battle sometimes.
And Earl asked, any experience with mixing with just stock plugins? And just to keep this short and sweet, you can get great mixes with stock plugins. You don't need premium plugins. In fact, stock plugins will get you 80% of the way there, if not more. So don't ever feel like you need premium plugins or that you can't get to where you want to go with stock plugins, because it's just simply not true.
Agreed, 100%. Look, the tools are important, but they're not what separates good mixes from great mixes. If you're looking, I think what you said in your presentation, if you're looking at the tools and saying, man, if I only had that tool or this tool, my mixes would sound great, you're barking up the wrong tree. I think you can achieve great sounding mixes with stock plugins, absolutely. And I just want to expand this question a little bit and talk about the paradox of having too many choices. So I think in today's world, we have so many options, so many tools, there are a million different EQs and compressors. And so there's this tendency to feel like we need it all. And so we get a gas, as you said, Rob, and buy a million tools. And then we wonder why our mixes don't sound good. And so I think, it becomes really important, I think, to really figure out what are the kind of core things that I really need here. And so my approach is actually, rather than having a million different EQs and compressors and a million different tools, I've really, like you said, I've developed, I have one tool, one EQ that I use the majority of the time. It's FabFilter's Pro Q2, which is a great EQ. Stock EQs are great too. I have one compressor, which is the Oxford Dynamics. I'm not telling you these so you can go out and buy more tools. I'm just sharing what I find is helpful. And these aren't like the penultimate plugins. These are just what I've found to be helpful. And so I have one plugin for each of these kind of things I'm going to need. And so the reason why this is helpful is because it forces you to focus more on the decisions that really matter. And really, it doesn't matter which of your 12 EQs you use. I mean, it might make a small difference, but what really matters much more is what you do with those tools. And so by having kind of go-to plugins for each of your kind of tools, for EQ, for compression, for reverb, the question doesn't become which of my 12 EQ plugin should I choose? The question becomes, what do I do with this EQ? Which I think is much more important. And so forcing yourself to kind of stay in that mindset by narrowing and purposely limiting your choices, I think can actually help you achieve better sounding mixes at the end of the day.
And to expand on that a bit, you just got another question: stock versus why not talk about free plugins? That's the bit I wanted to address there, because this follows on with that. Just because they're free doesn't mean that you should use them, because again, there's a time investment there. There's not a monetary investment, but the time it would take you, spending hours like finding them or comparing and looking at reviews, B, then learning them, and then if you have a load, then when you load up a mix and you have like 10 different free EQs, you don't know which one to choose. There are cases where if you have maybe, and this is unlikely, but if in your DAW you don't have a certain plugin that you need. So for example, Pro Tools doesn't come with a multiband compressor. That's not necessarily a plugin that you need. In fact, I don't think it's at all. You can mix without that. But if you wanted to mix with multiband compression, you could go out there, and there are actually, I know a couple of really good free multiband compressors. So there are situations where they're good to use. Saturation as well. I know that's something else that a lot of DAWs don't come with. But again, make sure the need comes first. If you recognize, I don't have this plugin, I need it. You don't necessarily even have to go out and buy it. Try out some free plugins first. But just don't fall into that rabbit hole of getting obsessed with having like all the latest free plugins.
I think that's great advice, because we're kind of this culture of like we're hoarding all these tools, right? And so it ends up becoming like a full-time job just trying to figure out like what EQ you need or what, and so you become obsessed with the process versus what Rob was talking about, which is the why, or the why am I even using this tool in the beginning, or what am I trying to achieve? I think the more tools you have, the easier it is to get caught up in focusing on kind of the wrong part of the process. So I think, and I'll add just on this, I think cracked plugins are the same way. People think, oh man, it's so cool. I can download the Waves Premium Platinum bundle and I have like 800 plugins. But okay, so now you have a bunch of plugins that you have no idea how they sound like. You have no idea when you might use one versus the other. So you end up actually shooting yourself in the foot. And I think it's a much better approach to start with the stock tools, like Rob was saying, in your DAW. And really, I'm not saying this as a cop-out. I think some of these stock plugins are incredible, and you can absolutely achieve great sounding mixes with them and them alone.
And there's a couple more questions here in a similar kind of vein that I just want to tie in. Sebastian said, I think it's a typo. I think it should be what type of EQ you use when you start. And again, your stock EQ. If you're not sure what type of EQ, just use your stock EQ. Down the line, there are differences. Analog modeling EQ versus like a fully parametric EQ. They do have their uses, but until you're really confident with your stock EQ, you don't need to worry about that. And then another question, I said, did you ever try to restrict yourself with just stock plugins? Yeah, and I think that's a great technique. If you ever find that that's a good way for focus practice, something I talked about earlier, maybe you just sit down for one evening and say, I'm going to strip it back and I'm just going to mix this track with stock plugins. But also, I highly recommend people do this when they start out. They restrict themselves to stock plugins and just don't even think about premium plugins for a very long time. It's not so much a restriction because they're going to sound great, but just kind of trying to force yourself not to venture out of that for as long as possible. And then trying it every now and then in the future.
And learning, the kind of fundamentals, I think it can be much easier to do that with stock tools. Like you should know what the attack and release and threshold and these parameters on a compressor do before you go out and buy a million modeling compressors and all these fancy tools. Understanding the fundamentals of kind of how these tools work, I think stock plugins can be great for that, because that's all they give you. So you're not kind of being distracted by all this analog modeling stuff. And just a point on that analog modeling thing, because I think there's so much romanticism around trying to recreate these tools that existed, 40, 50 years ago that everybody used. Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy that as an industry, the best thing that we can do is try to replicate the best stuff of 50 years ago. I think if you're looking forward, let's take away the romanticism behind all of these tools, because if you talk to the people that designed these pieces of gear, the 1176, the SSL, bus compressor, all of these tools, they'll tell you they were full of compromises. And ironically, we've romanticized them to this degree that we think that these are the tools that we need, when in reality, I think there are a lot of modern tools that are much better. That's how I feel. So I'd much rather have a modern compressor than a 1176, which is going to tie my hands. It's not as flexible. So you don't need all this old school stuff. You got to ignore, some of the marketing behind some of these plugins, like Rob was saying. You watch these videos and UAD and Waves, and they're all trying to sell plugins. I mean, that's what they're doing. And so they show these videos with these, top tier mixers and fancy studios talking about how crucial this one tool was to their sound. And maybe that was true 50 years ago, but today we have better tools. And so as modern mixers, you should be trying to find the best tools of today, not the best stuff that worked 50 years ago.
It's something that we've spoken about before in regards to analog EQs. I think one of the main benefits for me, not as much now, but kind of a few years ago, was with analog modeling EQs, because you can't see the curve. I think that's sometimes a good way to really learn to, first of all, mix with your ears, and secondly, not be afraid to go aggressive when you need to.
I like that, yeah.
Because sometimes if you pull up like a fully parametric EQ and you're like, okay, you have an intention, and to get there, you have to like do some crazy stuff, and it looks like it should just not be, it should not be allowed. But right. When you do that with an analog EQ, you're purely using your ear. But yeah, this is like way down the line and definitely not something to focus on.
Right. Okay. So I think so let's take we'll take two more questions and then we're gonna hop off, just because I'm really enjoying this.
Yeah.
And I hope you guys are getting a ton of value. I mean, we got a lot of people who have stuck around, right till the very end. So if you guys are still watching this, I hope we've been helpful to you.
You're awesome.
And this is, well, before we get into the last two questions here, we should probably talk about the workshop that we're gonna be doing this upcoming week. So I have a course that's coming out called Mixing Low End, and it'll be launched in about a week or so. But to kind of lead up to this course, I put together a free workshop that's all about mixing low end. So if you're struggling to achieve a good sounding low end in your mixes, which I think is one of the most challenging parts of the mixing process, this workshop is going to go through some really specific tactics and techniques and kind of big picture stuff that's going to allow you to really achieve a low end that sounds great in any mix. So that's going to be coming up. If you're on my list and you're getting my emails, you're going to hear more about this this upcoming week. And if you're on Rob's list, and you came to this webinar through him, he's also going to be emailing out about that. So just keep an eye out, and we'd love to see you there. I think it would be great to have you in.
And just to clarify on a couple of things, first of all, the course, it's incredible. I've done it myself, and it had an impact on my mixes. It's very well structured. But secondly, the workshop, it's completely free. Just to clarify that as well. This is a few videos that are going to really have an impact. I think it's kind of from what I gather, it's like the best bits of the course kind of taken out in a sense, and that's super valuable. So keep an eye out for that, because low end, such an important thing.
Absolutely. So let's do one or two more. Let's do two more questions here, and then we'll let you guys go. I'm just looking through here.
Oh, also, before I forget, for everyone that's still here now, if you want some templates, these are the templates that I use for that kind of mix prep stage. There's also a whole vocal processing chain on there, just to kind of guide you in the right direction. Bypass it all. You don't have to use everything. There's quite a lot on there, just to clarify with this. But just to give you a starting point, just save you a bit of time, help you to be a bit more efficient when you're prepping for a mix, and then even mixing as well. Grab those templates. It's Logic, Studio One, Pro Tools, and Cubase, I believe. Page not found. Let me address that now. Do you want to grab a question while I see what this link?
Yeah, sure. I'm just looking through here. Let's see. This is interesting. So Carl says, what's a good starting rate to charge for mixing? And I think a lot of people, if you're kind of first starting out and getting into the what do you charge? I think this is an interesting question. So first thing I'll say is that there is no number that is the right number that you should start at. I think what you have to think about is, to a certain extent, when you're first starting out, I think it becomes, who are you working with and what are they able to afford? And then at a certain point, you should be raising your rates over time, and you're naturally going to start to deal with higher profile clients that you can charge more, et cetera. I think, when you're starting out, the first piece of advice that I would give is, even if you charge a little bit, I would avoid, mixing for free as much as possible. I think when you're maybe just getting started, it can be good to do some free stuff. But there's kind of this psychology thing that happens when people get something for free, they don't value it as much. And so oftentimes you find that when you start mixing for free, the clients that you're dealing with end up being a total pain. It's weird. It's kind of like a mindset thing. People just don't value the work that you're doing, and so it can be incredibly demoralizing. So I would say, even if you're charging $50 for a mix, I think it's better to start there than to start free. The next thing I'll say, is that over time, I think you can start to raise your rates. And you're naturally, look, your $50 clients are not going to suddenly become your $250 clients or $500 or $1,000 clients. So you're going to have to, that's a tricky thing to navigate. And I've navigated this several times over the years as my rates have gone up. It's tricky to have that conversation with past clients. And so at a certain point, you have to recognize that, if you've been charging $50 for a mix or $100 for a mix, and then you just jump up and charge $300 or $500, some of those people are probably not going to stick around, but that's okay. It's just, that's part of the process of leveling up. So, and the last thing I'll say is that what you do is worth paying for. And I think you got to think of it through this lens of, mixing is a service that is valuable, that not a lot of people can do well. And so if you're a good mixer, you should absolutely be charging for your services. Don't be afraid. 100%. It's what you're doing is valuable. And so, don't let people convince you that you should be giving them stuff for free. That's not my vote personally.
And I think it's, once you have that realization of, it's very easy to undervalue yourself at first. And even if you are charging, don't charge too little, because this is another common mistake. People charge far too little, and charging more, for a lot of people, inherently feels like a bad thing. For some reason, they feel bad for charging more when they could do it for less. But that's not the way you think of it. You're providing, like Jason said, quite a unique service. It's not a commodity. It's not just something where you can undercut everyone else.
Now, you want to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, if you feel like you're charging too much, then just take a step back and really look at it and think about how you can, first of all, make sure you're delivering enough value, which you probably already are, to warrant that price tag. But then also, if you're struggling with this kind of stuff, there are things you can do. You can be more specific, all these kind of stuff. I don't want to go into marketing too much now. What were you going to say?
I agree 100%. I think getting out of that kind of bottom tier where it's all like these online, mixing services for $25, they'll mix you got to get out of that, because those people don't care about the work that you're doing. Those are clients that just want it cheap, as cheap as possible. And so once you start, if you're dealing in that price range where the only people that are coming to you are people that just want a cheap mix, then no one cares, what quality of work you're doing, and they're immediately going to leave as soon as they find someone who can do it cheaper. So the key is pricing can actually be a strategy that allows you to attract the type of clients that you want to be working with. And this is, a lot of people don't think about this. By charging premium prices, you're actually able to attract a caliber of client who is going to be much more interested in the what you can uniquely bring to their project and to the table, versus the first question that people are going to be asking, which is, how cheap can I get it and how fast can it be done? Those are not the types of clients that you want to be working with.
And equally, if you charge more, you can take on less. Well, you don't have to, but generally, if you charge little, you have to work a lot harder to just make a living, which is going to lead to some kind of loss in quality at the end of the day. If you have less clients, you're able to spend more time with each of those clients, and it's just going to be more enjoyable for you as a mixer to work with less people at a higher price than more people at a lower price.
Yeah, 100%. And there was one more question here that I just want to address on that. People, one person was saying, should I charge by the hour or charge by the mix or by the project? So my vote is absolutely charge by the project. When you go into a grocery store and grab a box of cereal, they don't say, well, this took 3 hours to make the oats and then, put them in the box and then send it to the grocery. They give you a flat rate for the project, or for the cereal, excuse me. So I think flat rate is the way to go. That's how all the professional mixers are doing it, and it's just more transparent. It's more upfront, for everyone. Your clients know what to expect. You know what to expect going into it. And then just making sure that you're setting some limits around what you're providing. So you're not in a situation where, 28 revisions later, you're like kicking yourself and being like, man, I should have charged by the hour. I think flat rate is the way to go, personally.
Yeah. And you're delivering a final product. Essentially, you're not selling your hours or your time. You're selling a finished thing.
Bingo. Yeah. Nobody cares how much time it took for you to do it. All they care is how does the mix sound? Whether you did it in 2 hours or 12 hours, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how it sounds. 100%. I agree.
Okay. Should we do one?
Yeah, we'll do one more and then we'll head out. I want this to be a good one. Let's see what we can find here.
So a couple of revision-based questions. I mean, a lot of people do 2 revisions free. Just to answer that quickly, is that what you do?
I don't put a cap on revisions. The way I approach this with my clients is really from a standpoint of, I try to make them feel like I'm always on their side, because I am, and that's the truth. And so oftentimes what ends up happening, and we all know this when if you've dealt with clients and you start moving down the revisions process, is a mix is like a house, right? And if you start to change too much, if you start to pull out the ground floor and change all the windows and everything, suddenly the mix kind of falls apart. And so a better way I've found to handle this is, you got to realize the psychology of what's going into this. When someone's hiring you to do a mix, this is the final part of the process. There's a lot of fear and insecurity that is involved, because they're finishing, they're kind of putting the bow on what they've created. And oftentimes they've been working on this for a year or 2 years. So there's a lot of fear there with kind of wrapping that up. So rather than kind of saying, and this is just what I found works for me, rather than saying, 2 revisions, I'm going to cut you off. I think I find, if I have a conversation with someone and just say, hey, look, what we have here is really special. You've spent a ton of time working on this. And I think if we move further, there's a chance that we might ruin what's special about what you've created here. So guiding them through that process versus being, against them and trying to kind of cut them off can make them feel like, hey, this guy's on my side. He's trying to do what's best for me. It's not about doing another revision. It's about what's best for them at the end of the day. It's about, knowing that I've been down this road, and if we do 27 revisions, we're going to ruin this. And then you're going to come back to me and say, hey, the Nix number 2 sounded its best. So guiding them through that process, I think, can sometimes be helpful. We're educating as much as we are providing a service.
I think you're completely right. And it's interesting because the natural approach is to say, right, to kind of protect yourself and be like, okay, only X amount of revisions are included. But essentially that's not in the best interest of the client in either way, whether there's no revisions or there's 20. So I guess it's having the confidence to not even, try and protect yourself and just negotiate, treat each client as an individual human being as they are.
Yeah. And people are reasonable. I find you get that client sometimes, but where it's just a nightmare. But for the most part, I find that if you explain these kinds of things, like, people understand. And if the mix is still getting better, then I'll keep going, because oftentimes it does get better, and so if we're making improvements and things sound like they're really coming together and on revision 3 or 4, I'm not going to stop. Like, I want what's best for them, which is a great sounding mix. It doesn't happen very often, but anyways.
You're so modest.
No, I'm just kidding. It often does. It often does get better in the revisions process. So, all right. So I think, how does that sound as kind of a bow on the end of this thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out as well, it seems we've got a couple of issues we've had issues with URLs and stuff. So if you had any trouble accessing any of that kind of like additional content, in about 2 hours time, you'll get an email with a link with the replay, so you can watch it back again, or if you missed any of it. And also I'll make sure there's links there to the your bonuses, the action pack, and the templates as well.
Awesome. And before we let you guys go, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. It's such an honor for us to be able to share what we've learned with you. And so I hope you've found a ton of value, out of this. And if you have, we'd love to hear from you too. So shoot us an email, and say, hey, and introduce yourself. I mean, it's sometimes weird doing this, where you feel like you're just talking to a screen. But obviously there's a bunch of real people on the other side. So we'd love to hear from you guys. It makes us feel good. And
honestly, it makes my day every time someone says, oh, I did this thing you said, and suddenly it's working.
Yeah, that's the best.
My week done.
Absolutely. So I hope you guys found this helpful, and again, reach out to us and keep an eye out for that Mixing Low-End workshop this week. I think you'll find that helpful if you found this helpful. And anyways, take care.
Thanks everyone.
Bye guys.
See you soon.